As you know, Bleach has a ton of amazing fights, but really, narrowing down the absolute greatest is an almost impossible task, with incredible battles spanning the entire narrative. And so, in today's video, we're going to take a look at the best fight from each of the different story arcs. Now again, even though we've widened the field here by taking the multiple story arcs into account, this wasn't easy. Certainly for some of the arcs, there are just so many excellent fights, iconic duels, and the like, so I've included a runner-up each time. However, to get a more in-depth view of the series' best fights, we'll be splitting the arcs up by what I think is the most commonly accepted means by the community. So, for example, rather than just having the absolute best fight of the Arrancar arc as a whole, we'll have the best fights from the Arrancar Invasion, the Hueco Mundo Arc, and the fake Karakura Town arc, and so on and so forth. Although we won't be including smaller sub-arcs, the likes of Turn Back the Pendulum, Everything But the Rain, where they maybe have one fight each to their name, and so it's essentially a foregone conclusion. Generally speaking, I think this approach works when you consider the likes of the Arrancar arc is about 3 times as long as the Soul Society arc, for example, and the same goes for the likes of the Lost Agent when compared with the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive in. What are the best fights from the individual Bleach story arcs? Let's take a look. Before we get started, consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already. It really would mean the absolute world to me. And if you haven't done, check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. We're uploading pretty consistently over there now, and we're doing fairly well as a result. Thank you again to everyone who has gone and checked out the videos. It really does make a huge difference. I'll be covering most, if not all, of the big gaming shows happening over the next week or so. So consider checking out that channel if you're interested in that at all, and leaving a like, maybe subscribe too, if you want to help support the channel growth. It really would mean the absolute world. So of course we have to begin with the very first arc of Bleach, the Agent of the Shinigami Arc, and as you might expect, this one is a little weird when it comes to fights. As the introduction to the world and story of Bleach, the fights don't quite have the same stakes, the same weight that many would later on, and are a mostly episodic series of Monster of the Week style battles as Ichigo gets used to his new life as a substitute Shinigami. That being said, there are still a few great fights to be had here in the first arc, so let's begin with our runner-up. While Ichigo vs Renji introduces us to the concept of Shikai for the very first time, the idea of Zanpakuto is blown wide open by Ichigo vs Urahara, as the substitute Shinigami's final test before heading to the Soul Society to rescue Rukia. With Kisuke challenging Ichigo to try and knock the hat from his head, the two of them fight, but the shopkeeper overpowers Ichigo at every turn, demolishing the very blade Ichigo is holding until there is nothing left, as Kisuke fiercely wields his own Benihime, also teasing this mysterious character's true strength. Finally, in one of the series' most iconic moments, Ichigo unlocks his own Shikai, the first version of it anyway, with a ferocious roar, conjuring Zangetsu at last, and even forcing Kisuke to manifest a blood mist shield to protect himself as the fight comes to an explosive end. However, the best fight of the Agent of the Shinigami arc has to be Ichigo vs Grand Fisher. The first truly emotional fight of the series, the first duel to really feel like it has major stakes at play. This is a moment of enormous maturity for Ichigo, even this early on in the story, as he battles the monster that killed his mother amidst a graveyard. And Grand Fisher himself feels like a genuine character, a genuine villain, much more so than the hollows that come both before and after in this arc, a terrifying embodiment of evil with a design that Kubo uses wonderfully. Looking back, it's kind of crazy to think that this fight takes place within the first 25 chapters of Bleach, but it does, and it's handled really well, forcing Ichigo to confront the trauma of his mother's death early on. And his eventual defeat of Grand Fisher is well earned and cathartic as a result. Right, but with the very first arc done, we now move on to the Soul Society arc, and this is where the true essence of this video comes alive. This is where it actually becomes difficult to select these winners from such a crowded and esteemed pool. Well, the runner-up anyway. This is perhaps the single most iconic arc of Bleach, with some of the most iconic fights of the bunch. As a result, there were a ton of options vying for the coveted runner-up position. Ichigo versus Renji, Renji versus Byakuya, Ichigo versus Kenpachi, hey, perhaps even Yoruichi versus Soifon. The list kind of goes on. To be honest, if you chose any of those fights to be the second best of the arc, I wouldn't argue. But for me, the runner-up for best fight of the Soul Society arc is clear, and it's Uryu versus Mayuri. This is Uryu's big moment. Everything has been leading to this. His entire character arc comes full circle here when he finally comes face to face with the monster who not just experimented on the Quincy in various brutal ways for years, but who also mutilated his grandfather and caused his death by delaying Shinigami reinforcements in the human world. In many ways, Uryu never feels more traditionally Quincy than he does here, displaying his genius-level ability in numerous ways, using Ransou Tengai and of course his Let's Still, the culmination of everything he's worked to achieve. And what a finale too, the kind of epic conclusion to a fight that Kubo completely nailed time and time again in the Soul Society arc and then struggled to replicate many times over in the future. Uryu's ultimate form versus Mayuri's horrifying bankai, the first we ever saw in the series. Ironically, this fight, the finale to this fight, and the way Uryu is depicted, set the expectation for the Vandenreich and the battles between Captain and Sternritter later on down the line, an expectation that very few of them ever truly lived up to. But, I mean, without a doubt, the absolute best fight of the Soul Society arc has to be Ichigo versus Byakuya, as if it was ever really in contention. Perhaps one of the most iconic and famous fights, not just in Bleach, but in Shonen altogether. This is a landmark duel in manga. Successfully built up over the course of the entire arc, Byakuya was always the ultimate end goal for Ichigo in his development, and when the time comes, the battle does not disappoint, feeling like a true showpiece for Kubo's mastery of the medium. Both fighters go all out, as Ichigo reveals Getsuga Tensho for the first time, and Byakuya unleashes his bankai to devastate the substitute Shinigami. But of course, the most triumphant moment of all is the much-anticipated reveal of Ichigo's own bankai Tensa Zangetsu, maybe the single most recognizable moment in the history of Bleach. Cap this fight off with the tantalizing twist of a mysterious, seemingly sinister force taking control of Ichigo's body, a catalyst for the entire arc to follow, and you've got a genuine, all-time great battle. Maybe even the very best in Bleach. And then things slow down just a little as we move into the early stages of the Arrancar arc. But that doesn't mean there aren't some amazing fights to be had. With Aizen's Arrancar army revealing themselves to the Gotei 13, there are technically now more fights than ever before, and so singling out the very best is a somewhat tricky proposition. Now, there are more than a few memorable moments here in the Arrancar Invasion portion of this arc, specifically the introduction of Grimmjow, leading to a pair of fantastic showdowns between himself and Ichigo. And to be honest, I could have been tempted to put Ichigo vs Grimmjow Round 2 as the runner-up here. The idea of an 11-second battle is a cool novelty, plus Shinji showing up will never not be awesome. However, for me, the runner-up of the Arrancar Invasion has to be Ichigo versus White during his Vizard training. With Ichigo's impending and seemingly inevitable holification looming, his battle against White, whom he believes to be a malevolent, corrupting force, is eye-opening. With both Ichigo and White using bankai at the same time, the two of them clash in Ichigo's inner world, White threatening to take over Ichigo's body entirely, while on the outside the Vizard come face to face with the materialization of Ichigo's latent hollow power. While it's really awesome seeing and having the novelty of Ichigo facing off against his sinister mirror image, of course this fight is famous for White's incredible "the king and his horse" speech, which defines their relationship, at least for now. And Ichigo eventually turning the tables on White and defeating him is a great moment too, especially as White warns him not to die in the future, lest he return to take over completely. Something that of course happens nearly 150 chapters later. For added depth, this duel is completely recontextualized by the 1000-Year Blood War arc, with White literally telling both Ichigo and the reader that he is Zangetsu. However, my number one pick for the Arrancar Invasion is maybe a surprising one, but every time I go back to reread this fight, I can't believe how good it is, how weirdly good it is. And that's Ikkaku versus Edrad. This is an epic, evenly matched back and forth, way better than it has any right to be, drawn impeccably well here in the manga. There are various dynamic spreads of Ikkaku and Edrad facing off against one another, taking on one another in the night skies above Karakura town, and this entire fight feels so much more epic than, like I said, it really has any right to be. Ikkaku and Edrad's respective fighting styles combine to produce a savage yet artful physical display, and of course Edrad reveals the first resurrection of the entire series. But the crown jewel of this fight is the shocking reveal of Ikkaku's bankai, which to this day is, in my opinion, the stereotypical benchmark for all bankai reveals. It has every trope that I both love and associate with a bankai reveal. Ikkaku completely backed into a corner with seemingly no options left, yet at the same time he bemoans having to use his bankai at all, a true trump card in the truest sense of the word, and ending the chapter with an incredible cliffhanger as he activates his ultimate move. Fantastic stuff, and the inherent respect Edrad shows him feels so detached from other Arrancar too. Alright, but moving on now to the Hueco Mundo Arc, and as perhaps expected, this is a real step up from the Arrancar Invasion, which is only natural when you consider the Espada themselves are now fully involved in the fighting. There are some battles here that I'm not hugely into, like Xyloporo's overly long and drawn-out showdown, but for the most part this is a solid set of fights. And so in the runner-up spot this time, we have Ichigo vs Grimmjow Round 3, which I think may be a contentious pick, but for myself at least, this has never quite been up there with the likes of Ichigo's very best milestone fights. But it's still an incredible battle, and the ultimate culmination of Ichigo and Grimmjow's budding rivalry, with Grimmjow unleashing his resurrection to fight Ichigo and displaying an entire legion of abilities. Meanwhile, Ichigo has never felt more in line with his hollow powers, more in tune with his hollow powers than he does here, and it's refreshing to see him aggressively challenging Grimmjow. I'm not a huge fan of how Ichigo comes to overpower Grimmjow by Orihime basically telling him not to get hurt anymore, but that's kind of by the by. More than anything, this is a fitting conclusion to Grimmjow's story, and it ends in a suitably epic way. However, the best fight in the Hueco Mundo arc, in my opinion, actually belongs to the very first Espada battle to take place during this portion of the story, Rukia vs Aranjero. This is a surprisingly emotional battle. In a sense, there's no build-up. The twist that Aranjero is in fact Kaien comes out of nowhere, but that's why it's so effective. And then, as the battle progresses, you realise that actually there was build-up to this moment all along. Everything Rukia experiences in the Soul Society arc, her flashback, her trauma, it all comes to a head here in a very clever way. Rukia's battle with Aranjero is brutally savage as well, in a way Bleach fights kind of stopped being in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. She struggles with all her might here, and pulls off some incredible feats in the face of ostensibly a much more powerful foe. Aranjero, being Kaien, transforms this battle, elevating it from what could have been a generic boss battle into a heartfelt chapter of real growth for Rukia, and a trial by fire for her as well. Okay, and finally we have the last third of the Arrancar arc, the fake Karakura Town arc. This is a tricky one. I'm going to be including both Deicide and the concurrent battles in Hueco Mundo here, as they all come together to make up the very final showdown of the Arrancar arc, hundreds of chapters in the making. What this means is that on a per chapter basis, This is the section of the story crammed full with the most fights at any one point, and there really are a lot. There are a bunch that honestly could have made the cut, so many that made the shortlist. Kyoraku versus Stark, Aizen versus the Gotei 13, Ichigo versus Aizen, but many of you probably already know what my runner-up is. Of course, it's Komamura and Hisagi versus Tosen, which remains in my mind a perfect microcosm of a Bleach battle. While it is a little short considering the gravity of the duel itself, it really is wonderful seeing Komamura and Hisagi taking on their fallen former friend, as Tosen reveals his devastating new power, Hollowification. Seeing Komamura wielding his bankai as he tries to keep up with Tosen is a sight to behold. Watching Hisagi pleading with his captain for some sanity in an effort to get through to him is gut-wrenching stuff. And then, of course, we see that Tosen is much too far gone, as he transforms with a shocking resurrection, becoming too powerful for Komamura to bear, leading to the twist ending where a seriously wounded Hisagi returns to finish off Tosen for good. It's a powerful but profoundly sad fight. Again, another one that had been built up to for years, one that felt inevitable as these former allies crossed swords on the battlefield at long last. They were on a collision course for so many years. However, the absolute best battle of the Fate Karakura Town arc is obvious, and it's Ichigo versus Ulquiorra, pretty much without question. In my opinion, this is really the only fight in the series capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with Ichigo versus Byakuya, as it feels very much its counterpart. This battle, one of the darkest in all of Bleach, takes us to the apex of Ichigo's descent into Hollowdom against seemingly completely hopeless and bleak odds. In terms of consecutive chapters, I think this is the single longest fight in all of Bleach, and Kubo doesn't waste a panel. Everything here happens for a reason, a smaller part of a wider story. From the interventions of Lowly, Menoli, Yami, and even Uryu, to Ichigo's unbreakable resolve in the face of Ulquiorra's unprecedented Segunda Etapa. Ichigo's unbelievable death and Zangetsu's resurrection help the fight culminate in the ultimate finale, one that pays off that battle between Ichigo and White so many chapters ago, as Ichigo is quite literally torn between his lingering humanity and his festering hollow powers, with his friends paying the price as they find themselves caught in the crossfire. It's a brilliant, epic, terrible, mournful fight, and it completely changes the game for our heroes, to the point where it had such a profound and unforgettable impact that the trauma of the darkness atop the dome is still affecting our main characters over 300 chapters later. No other fight has that kind of staying power. Now, I know there are some conflicting opinions on whether Ichigo versus Ulquiorra should really be considered a Fate Karakura Town fight. I do, since it takes place after the Fate Karakura Town arc begins in terms of chapters and is clearly happening at the same time, but I understand those who don't, since it doesn't take place in the Fate Karakura Town. So if we're not considering it a Fate Karakura Town fight, if we're considering it a Hueco Mundo fight, then this fight wins the Hueco Mundo invasion segment, and then here, Komamura and Hisagi versus Tosen is my winner, and Aizen versus the Gotei 13 is my runner-up, purely thanks to it having the single best Aizen moment from the entire series in it. So now we arrive at the Lost Agent arc, and truth be told, there aren't a lot of fights in contention here. In fact, the top two are likely pretty obvious, I'd imagine, so let's just dive right in. My runner-up for this arc is Byakuya vs Tsukishima, which is a genuinely great and often overlooked fight. To be honest, this is probably my favourite battle of the arc. The atmosphere is moody and sinister, Byakuya is narratively the perfect opponent for Tsukishima, and Tsukishima's twisted power of Book of the End is used to an incredibly creative and satisfying degree here. Seeing Tsukishima using his power to not only push Byakuya into a corner, but enable himself to keep up with and outmaneuver the captain is exactly how a totally busted power like Book of the End should be used in battle. Seeing Byakuya outwit Tsukishima by fighting in a way that's completely unlike him, by grabbing his own blade petals and then punching through Tsukishima's chest, brings the battle to a visceral and cathartic end. However, while Byakuya vs Tsukishima may be my favourite battle, Objectively, I can't deny that the best fight of the arc has to be Ichigo versus Ginjo, closing out the Lost Agent arc in a fantastic way that brings everything full circle. With the two substitute Shinigami clashing at last, Ginjo's true nature made clear, and Ichigo's Shinigami powers returned to him, this is a battle of ideals. It's not even down to the fact that Ichigo disagrees with Ginjo fundamentally, or what he stands for, as Ginjo himself muses that Ichigo will deny who he is, but with the fact that Ichigo wants to bring Ginjo's own pain to an end, to stop his everlasting path of destruction, and ultimately in both the eyes of the Fullbringers and Ginjo himself, to save him from himself. It's an excellent, well-balanced battle featuring an incredible showdown as Ichigo reveals his new bankai in a way that parallels the original, while Ginjo also uses the power of bankai that he stole from Ichigo. There's something incredibly satisfying about seeing just how strong Ichigo has become in the way he completely shuts down what Ginjo tries to do, how, with the help of his friends and the Gotei 13, he was able to overcome his demons. I do wish the finale to their fight had maybe lasted a little longer, but all in all, this was exactly the showdown the Lost Agent arc needed to close out with. And so that brings us to the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and again, this is an arc with maybe more fights per chapter capita than ever before, and that makes total sense considering this is Bleach's war arc. But we're opening with the first third or so of the arc, which is the first Quincy invasion, and that portion of chapters doesn't actually have that many fully fledged fights in it, despite the fact the battle is constantly ongoing, almost from start to finish. Despite that, there are a few that definitely could have made the cut. Ichigo and the Arrancar vs Kyuuge OP is not only a fantastic old-school Bleach fight, but one that masterfully introduced us to the Vandenreich. Yamamoto vs Driscoll is very one-sided, but hugely satisfying. And of course, Kenpachi vs Unohana is brilliant in its own right, very well written and surprising in many ways, though a little bit annoying that Unohana had to die for the fruits of the fight to really take root. But my runner-up goes to perhaps the most devastating battle of the first invasion, the one that, for many people, myself included, completely embodies the feel, the desperate hopelessness of the first invasion the best. Byakuya and Renji versus Asnod. What's so clever about this fight is the way Kubo lulled us into a false sense of security. Sure, everything is going to hell in the Serete, but Byakuya's appearance and his swift, effortless dispatch of masked masculine harken back to his other previous fights in earlier arcs. This is one of the Soul Society's most reliable and powerful warriors, who almost always comes out on top. Except this time the battle undergoes a rapid sequence of twists and turns that quickly throw Byakuya and his control off. From having his bankai stolen to experiencing the debilitating effects of Asnod's fear, suddenly, very rapidly, control has been snatched from Byakuya's hands, and Asnod takes advantage of that by eviscerating the captain with his own bankai, shredding his body and almost killing him in one of the most gory and grisly scenes in Bleach. The sequence where Renji attempts to rush in and stop the madness, trying to use bankai himself, only to be blindsided by Masked Masculine's surprise return, is one of my favourites in Bleach, because it's one of the few times the heroes so completely lose in a normal battle, a quote-unquote normal fight that doesn't involve any of the main characters, heroes or villains, and in such an abrupt and ruthless way. It was completely unexpected, completely shocking, and extremely effective. And of course, Byakuya's final rain-soaked conversation with Ichigo may be Bleach's best scene ever. But the greatest fight of the first Quincy invasion was likely pretty obvious from the get-go. Of course, it had to be Yamamoto versus Roid, where the first invasion itself finally came to a head in an explosive fashion. Completely consumed by murderous rage, the head captain at last uses his bankai, and we get to see it in all of its glory, spelled out for us. It was likely no easy feat, creating a bankai that would live up to Ryujin Jaka's legacy of untamable, mountainous power, but Kubo manages it with Zanka no Tachi. This is a battle that carries the weight of the arc's namesake on its back, and of course results in the soul-crushing death of Yamamoto himself, and with it, the absolute destruction of the Serete, and the hero's ultimate loss. I've never been a huge fan of the Roid Lloyd twist, to be totally honest, but at the end of the day, this is a crazy fight, and the battle that stands tall above the rest in the first portion of this final arc. The second Quincy invasion is where the arc takes a more traditional turn. We're treated to a slew of battles that take place one after the other, in sequence as the Shinigami battle the Quincy. As a result, there are a lot of fights to choose from here. But truth be told, they're either all too one-sided to really be satisfying, or they're over too quick, or they're interrupted. It's a pretty messy part of the arc, to be honest. However, there are a couple of fights that stand out to me among the rest. And so the runner-up this time goes to Kenpachi vs Gremmy, easily the longest battle of the second invasion, and one of the flashiest. And that's really all this battle is, at least on the surface level. Gremmy exists purely as a vehicle to help Kenpachi show off his new Shikai, which is undeniably a cool and very long-awaited reveal. And it's handled pretty spectacularly too, with Kubo drawing it out over the course of a few chapters until finally Kenpachi unleashes Nozarashi to obliterate Gremmy's meteor in the sky above. It's pure spectacle, and it works really well. Gremmy's own powers are also cool to see too, as he imagines all sorts of crazy twists and turns before eventually being undone by his own power. Now, I've never really loved the ending of this fight, but it is what it is. Kenpachi shows some nice development at the start of this battle too, but it kind of disappears by the time we reach Wahrwelt, which is a real shame. And so my winner this time is likely another expected one. Rukia vs Asnod, marking Rukia's second time in the winner's spot, which is impressive. Having trained in the royal palace, Rukia arrives on the battlefield and ends up facing Asnod, the sternritter who not only stole her brother's bankai but almost killed him. And back in the day, you better believe that everyone was hoping this matchup would happen. Using the true power of her Sode no Shirayuki, Rukia battles Asnod and his fear, managing to find a solution to nullify it and even going so far as to freezing the Sternritter himself. However, Asnod activates his Volsten dish and turns the tables on Rukia, trapping her in the fear until Byakuya himself arrives. Asnod's Volsten dish is easily one of the coolest transformations in the entire series. The fear is chock full of fantastic imagery, and of course the fight ends with another much expected but also highly anticipated reveal, Rukia's bankai, which is extremely well earned and well deserved. And while Asnod's Volsten dish might be one of the creepiest and coolest forms in Bleach, Rukia's Haka no Togame is one of Kubo's best designs, period, as she devastates the Sternritter with a single icy slash. And that brings us to Wahrwelt and the final battles of the series. Now, I'll be honest, this was actually the toughest one, I think, for me to decide on, as I think the fights are of a mixed bag in terms of quality here. And there simply aren't that many of them either, relatively speaking. Uryu vs Renji is excellent and unexpected, but it's anime only, whereas Basby vs Hashwolf is a wonderful if one-sided and fairly short duel, but one with a rich emotional resonance. The battle that's giving me the most pause is Kisuke and Yoruichi vs Askin, as I really do love it. But my favourite part of the fight, Kisuke vs Askin, is painfully short. And not only that, but the battle is clearly being rushed when compared to the previous two Schutzstaffel fights, and lacks depth as a result. I'm still hoping the anime will add a flashback for Kisuke and Yoruichi, much in the same way it definitely seems like Kubo wanted to in the manga. So that leaves me with two pretty clear choices, I'd argue, and the runner-up for Wahrwelt has to be Mayuri and Nemu vs Pernida. In the manga, this is an absolutely brilliant fight, and one that feels like it almost came out of nowhere. At last, not since his battle with Uryu, has Mayuri found himself so out of his depth. Pernida turns out to be a truly terrifying and overwhelming force of nature, and as the left arm of the Soul King itself, it really does live up to that name. Pernida totally controls the battlefield with its power of the compulsory, and forces the usually untouchable Mayuri onto the back foot in a big way. I think the best thing about this fight is the way Kubo uses Pernida to its fullest potential. Mayuri chops off a finger, so an entire new arm grows out of it, and quickly Mayuri finds himself in real trouble. It's great seeing the scientist actually struggling in a fight and having to rely on Nemu too, who shows remarkable growth as she helps him in his battle against what is effectively a divine entity. And speaking of which, the themes here are wonderfully rich too, with a man of science facing down divinity itself, while Nemu gets a beautiful flashback that seals her development in a tragic way. As Mayuri's final fight of the series, this battle is a massive success. But the very best fight of the Wahrwelt arc is, in my opinion, Kyoraku and Nanao vs Leal, which follows a very similar formula to Mayuri and Nemu vs Pernida, but ratchets everything up to 11. It's more interesting, the stakes feel higher, the characters are more powerful. This is an incredible fight, as Kyoraku sets out to prove his worth as the new Captain Commander, carrying the lives of his men and the world on his back. Meanwhile, he's facing off against Leal Barrow, the leader of the Schutzstaffel. Not the most interesting enemy ever, but terrifying and ruthlessly effective all the same, and that's really all he needs to be. Getting to see Kyoraku utilising some new games for Katen Kyokotsu at the start of the fight lends it a really old school and fun vibe, and then after Leal activates his Volstendish, the tone of the battle changes dramatically, and takes a progressively darker turn, resulting in the insane reveal of Kyoraku's bankai after so very long. Again, Nanao is involved in this fight in an interesting way, much in the same way Nemu was in the previous fight, and Kubo layers on a fantastic flashback for Kyoraku that really emboldens the tragedy that has followed this character wherever he goes. I'm not a massive fan of the fight's ending, and it is very contentious. The Deus Ex Machina reveal of the Shinken Hakyoken devised specifically to get them out of an otherwise unwinnable situation is a little annoying, but it's not enough to besmirch what is otherwise a brilliant, thematic, and deep fight. One that simply set the bar too high for the remaining Schutzstaffel battles to come. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it and hope you took something of value from this video today as well. Let me know down in the comments below, what are your favourite fights from each of the individual Bleach story arcs? I'd absolutely love to know your thoughts. And let me know how similarly our lists align, if I'm completely off base here, or if perhaps we're actually quite similar in our opinions of the best Bleach fights across the story. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please do let me know. Remember, consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already, it really does help out the channel, and check out Mr. Tomo Talks Games as well. Your support over there would make a massive difference and mean the absolute world to me as we go into a pretty busy season of games news, of new games being revealed. It's all promising to be very exciting, and I will try to cover as much of it as I can. And as always, I've got to end this video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who I simply wouldn't be able to keep doing this. Your support does mean the absolute world, and it is a genuine anchor during the sort of first half or so of the year where YouTube can be a little bit slower, so it does mean everything, and it makes a huge difference, so thank you all very much. Okay everyone, once again, thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.